many reasons, Louise. I think the first one was I had a deep passion for mathematics and science, and I didn't want to do some of the more traditional roles back then, which had been in the early 90s, not to give away too much of my age. So I was looking for sectors, that I could still use my mathematics and science ability. My older brother was already in mechanical engineering at the time, and that piqued my interest on engineering and in mining. And he had a SASOL bursary. So my maths and science passion, number one. Number two, I did come from a very humble background, and I was requiring financing. And being even financially astute back then, I didn't want it to be the traditional student loan. So I was looking for companies that would give me a bursary. And that was the second reason. The mining companies were excellent back in the day at providing bursaries, and therein entered Anglo-American. And I like saying that, those are the reasons that compelled me towards mining. But I then stayed because I absolutely loved what the industry was about and what the significance of a very responsible mining sector could yield. And that is why I've stayed for almost 25 years now. So those are the reasons. I think mining is in the journey of evolving. I would like to say that, from a sector point of view, we are definitely one of the better sectors in addressing, what women require for them to be firstly attracted to the industry and for women to thrive. Whether we are where we need to be by now, absolutely not. But I think there's a definite recognition that mining needs to do more to attract, enable the success of women in the industry. So firstly, we need you in mining. So I would like as many young women to consider the career. And the reason for, why women in the industry have worked out, not just for the woman from a career point of view, but from, how the industry has gained through diversity in thinking, is that, that's the partnership we need. We need young, bright, talented women to come into the industry, to see it as a career, but also to see it as a purpose of shaping an industry that's already in transition. I then need mining companies to basically get their house in order to make sure that these women do thrive in the industry. So for young women out there, I think the industry is far more receptive to your needs, but more so, we can really benefit from the transition and the reshaping that the industry is going through. It's about providing a platform for support. If I looked at the gaps that I faced coming into the industry, and although I joined a very supporting company then, but I didn't have the kind of support of being a person in minority for so many reasons. I was in the minority grouping then, didn't have the support. So, we can make this answer as difficult as get the right policies in place, make sure you have the right practices, have the right development programs. But I will simply put it down to ensure that a woman as a new recruit is supported across the board to make sure that she is best set up for success. I think depending on the level that you bring women into, but what comes to mind is making sure that, you're bringing in a woman and giving her voice at the right table, at the right platform. Making sure that you do take chances on women as well, because we need women coming through the ranks. So what we need is basically, making sure that we are, giving women more or taking more risks to give them more opportunities. I don't think that's happening enough. But then coming back to the point around support, bring her in, make sure she is supported, give her opportunities, right, to voice her opinion, give her room to do that, but more so take risk on her career development. And some of the things that have worked for me in my roles, both as CEO and in other C-suite roles, is being innovative in how we do this. Because if we had to wait for spaces to be created to allow this to happen, we'd be waiting for a long time. So I used to look at deputy positions, shadow positions for women, just to make sure that they had that seat at the table, so that they did have the voice where it matters most. So the real innovation here is not just sticking to traditionally what's worked well for recruiting and developing a man in the industry, but looking for how can we accelerate closing the gap through innovation in how do we actually recruit, develop and retain. A very loaded question there, Louise. I've seen a few things work very well. And what's working very well is, a lot of the push that we've been getting from industry bodies, from NGOs, etc., have become more pull factors within the sector. Leadership at all levels, including boards and executives, are demanding that diversity and inclusion becomes more of a priority. That was not the case in the past. So I'm definitely seeing a shift. I mean, as an example, the chairman of Vedanta, Anil Agarwal, on a fateful Saturday many years ago, called a meeting and told us executives, 7 CEOs, that he wants to see 15% of women in all of our excos by the Monday. This is the Monday after the Saturday. I've never seen such a bold act of leadership. And what he was doing in that one single act was making it very clear that the commitment was real. And he ended that conversation, Louise, by saying, well, if you can't do it, I'll find a CEO that can. So leadership commitment is number 1 on the list. I think linked with leadership commitment, because what gets asked for gets measured and ultimately gets done, is, we are doing a lot more to and I'm calling it the hard rewiring of the industry, on making sure we have more inclusive policies, be it blind recruitment, which I really subscribe to, from the standardization of policies and how we should be recruiting, how we should be developing. How do we create flexibility for women within the roles, in terms of maternity leaves, but just family flexibility as well is a lot more standardized. And I think maybe the last bit, outside of leadership, flexibility, policies, etc., we're becoming a far more inclusive industry, not only worrying about the mind gate, but we are extending these kinds of diversity and inclusion programs into communities, into our supplier chains, etc. So I think mining is becoming a far more inclusive ecosystem enabled by firmer leadership commitments and approach now in a far more standardized way than we ever have. And the term that I love using is we have to and we are hard rewiring the ecosystem around mining. Linking the point around the industry and why this is so important, I think there's just been so much more research, right, showing us the business case of why diversity matters. So outside of what I called kind of the push factors, the leadership commitments, on the back of more ESG focus, analytically and through research, we have so much more data showing today why diverse companies result or give best performance and hence bottom line results. I think that's also creating the right push in the right direction. So again, Louise, I think I could blame it, on not enough policies, practices, etc. But it's not all of that. It's mindset. I've seen varying maturity of mindset across the industry. And by mindset, I mean it's the fact that men in the industry right, can still get away with defending why they cannot find the right woman for the job. So the biggest barrier today is changing. I think what definitely is, a lot of supportive men in the minority to becoming supportive men and executives in the majority to try and become, not try to become the catalyst to get women into more senior roles. In my experience, I've seen men are very supportive up until a point, but when you sit shoulder to shoulder at the table with them, it's it's then we see that maybe they don't like the threat that you create. So we need egos left at the table. We need the realization after all of these years to finally say that the women exist, and it's time that the men in the industry change the mindset and take a far more risk-based approach and offer women seats at the table, even at the risk, to their egos or the risk to the industry, because it is the right thing for the industry. I think coming back to the word I used earlier around ecosystem, it's not about creating enablers within the mine fence, right, or the mine gate. There's a lot of societal barriers as well, especially and cultural ones. In certain communities, the roles of women are still, very archaic in terms of what's expected of them. So, on something that's far more difficult to tackle, I think what I'm calling for is not just the conversation within the mind gate, but having those societal, cultural conversations as well as to how the roles of women are evolving. Because if we continue to give women opportunities within the mining sector, and if a woman isn't being better supported, not only in the sector, but outside, in her personal life, we'll continue to overly burden women to play multiple roles that societies, demand of them. So I'm calling for a broader conversation so that there can be a shift with all relevant stakeholders and how the role of women are changing. And then within the industry, outside of what I spoke about, policies, etc., enabling her, I think there's a lot we can do to adapt our policies, etc., to the phase in which a woman is. It's not a one size fits all approach. When you're a young woman, you're probably still studying, you need a certain type of support. When you go on, to get married or have a family, you need a different kind of support. And I think there's something there about, retrofitting the woman's needs based on her life cycle within the company and a career to how companies can better support her. I was reflecting on this question because I was reflecting on a few questions, EY asked me, seems like a very long time ago. The advice is still consistent, right? Don't be constrained by what women in the past in this industry were not allowed to do, okay? Have an absolutely unconstrained view. Also think about, what you want to achieve as opposed to thinking about all of the barriers that's in the industry today. I'm also going to say that it's probably the best time for women to enter the industry because of all the pull-push factors we spoke about earlier, in terms of the demand from an ESG point of view for diversity and inclusion, for leaders now to take this as a core, initiative as before, one of where they gave it some discretionary support. This is probably the right time. So there's a lot more factors, I'd like to say tailwinds coming your way than it did for me all those many, many years ago. So don't be constrained by the past. There's a new baseline, and it's a baseline that is looking at enabling women seize this opportunity. And not only, are you going to join an industry that is far more, receptive to diversity and inclusion, but you're going to be given opportunities to make your voice count. So be prepared for thinking in an unconstrained way. So I've heard lots of controversy recently around quotas, right? And targets. Louise, I believe in it. I don't think it's the only enabler that's required, but I think when the regulator demands, it's an excellent push factor. So I think coupled with, how to make the push factor more sustainable. So it's not just one-off targets, but over a period of time, how do you get those targets? I completely agree that regulator push is is one of the many enablers that's required. I've personally benefited from this. As you rightly say, I finished school in 1993. I went to university in 1994, and I say that really changed the course of my career because I started, uni and then went on to work in a young post-apartheid South Africa, where, employment equity, HDSA, BE became the way business was being done. And for someone like myself, because there weren't that many of us, opportunities did come our way probably a lot faster than it would have. And it would have been easy to say, oh, well, I'm now being used as a quota and I'm not happy with, the fact that I'm being used. I didn't think that. I knew I was capable. I knew I had a lot more to learn, but I was very prepared to raise my hand and to push through the door that was open to me to own the space. And that is why I believe that quotas are the start of a push factor that the industry needs, and it is why we in South Africa has benefited from it. Coming into Canada, I'm quite staggered at the low percentages of representation. And I know it's not only about diversity and representation, it's about inclusion, but you can't have one without the other, right? You can't have inclusion without diversity and getting the numbers right. And we are so far behind in Canada that, I thought my colleagues in South Africa were not doing it fast enough. And now I see that that was probably the catalyst for why the industry moved, even at the pace that it moved, wasn't fast enough, but why the industry moved in the direction that it did. And in South Africa, I led a piece of work last year around women in mining. You probably know I took a bit of a sabbatical and I supported the Minerals Council with their women in mining strategy and roadmap. And, we agreed to as aggressive targets, or slightly more aggressive targets than what was sitting in then the Mining Charter 3. Do you know what was the most humbling moment in that process? When the collective CEO group, almost 33 of us at the time, equated, the quotas for women in mining or the quotas for diversity, gender representation as being 50%, as being, equity or equality, parity, and linking that to how zero harm is the only target in safety. And that was such a powerful commitment. So we have, CEOs in the South African mining industry who are saying, yes, we agree that we have quotas that we have to adhere to from a regulation point of view. But what we are working towards is a gender equal mining industry. That is incredibly powerful, and that is what the target should be. Two things. I think having supportive allies and mentors across the board. I had amazing line managers that always, advocated for me in my presence and in my absence. I think that had a lot to do with it. But also, advocates and mentors and sponsors that, actively invested time in my career, as in talking to me about my personal, I spoke about trade-offs of being a mother of young children, etc. I had very senior people invest time about how I should be thinking about it, leveraging, leaning on their experiences. As I was the chief of staff, head of office for Cynthia Carroll. Seeing a woman like her in action and having her support, me navigate through my career was invaluable, unbelievable support. So that's the first thing that helped. The second thing that helped was my mindset. So I never settled. I still don't settle. Uh, as much as the opportunities were coming my way, I did choose to pick up my hands, even when I was most uncomfortable and asked to be given opportunities as well. So I was supported, which is probably what made me brave and confident to pick my hand up and lean in more. Uh, but those would be the two, is the support I was given, and from my own personal side, using that support to then pick up my hand for opportunities that I might not ordinarily been either considered for, or opportunities that would have been discussed with me side of it. So when I was a mother of a very young daughter, this is now my eldest, today 21 years old. I think she would have been 2 years at the time. I was being given an opportunity to go run a plant in a very remote location, which is, from a natural progression point of view, if you're an engineer in the mining sector, there's certain things you have to do to climb up. I set up a meeting with the then CFO of Anglo Platinum at the time, Roland van Kerkhoven, and I told him who I was, the fact I was good at numbers. I just completed one of these certificate programs in finance from WITS. And I said, give me a chance in your corporate finance team. And he did. So instead of going to a remote plant site, which I would have loved to if I wasn't a mother of such a young daughter that I knew would disrupt the family more at that time, I changed the course of my career path by having a very bold conversation that I'm still to today not sure where I got the courage from. I had it, took a chance, and it worked out for me. So that's the one. I never got a finance degree because Roland at the time told me, go and get an MBA. And the joke I had was I went out and got pregnant twice after that as well. Never got the MBA. But then after Cynthia Carroll's office, I became the first non-CA CFO for one of the Anglo-American divisions, right? So there's something about, not just picking up your hand, but being almost fearless in your conviction that whatever the outcome is, it's something that you can make work for you. I wish I had known a little bit more about my true potential. I think, at a time when you come from a very disadvantaged background, as I did, I didn't attend one of the best schools. I didn't attend, one of the best universities. It was a good university, though. You don't come from the traditional club that, executives go on to, who come from certain clubs go on to become executives. I didn't know that even though I didn't have all of that in my background, I would go on to be successful. And I significantly doubted, my potential at the start. So simply put, Louise, I wished I dared to dream more early on in my career and not be constrained by the past, which is why it's my advice to young women joining the industry today.